in a pawn shop with a strange lien and a weird buyback clause. So we've all got our weaknesses, and one of mine is Bentleys. And over the years, I've tried to buy dozens of these cars, and I'm actually kind of proud of myself to say that I haven't bought any of them, because Bentleys, initially they occupy a pretty high price point, then they don't depreciate all that much for a couple of years, and then they have the catastrophic traditional depreciation that's inherent to all luxury cars. But if I'm going to spend as much money as they are new, I'm going to end up buying a Ferrari or a Lamborghini. But when I wait, I start to get scared, like anybody else would, of the impending maintenance liabilities. And so I've looked at them and I've come dangerously close to owning a bunch of them. I remember one was a Flying Spur Speed that had been in an annual accident for 4 or 5 consecutive years. Like almost to the day, this previous owner would crash it in some way. And it had been repaired pretty well, but for whatever reason, I didn't end up buying it. But the most interesting one that I ever came across was a 2004 Bentley Arnage T. And those late 03, 04 Arnages are just the quintessential perfection of British Bentleys, because after that you started to have the interference and kind of the meddling of Volkswagen as they tried to make them more reliable, and they brought in the GT cars, and it was, it's great for the brand, but it wasn't as pure and essentially British as these cars were. You had the 4-inch thick wool carpets and the rich leather and just that smell and everything about them that was so Bentley. So when I see one of those, I'm always hooked, but I've managed to avoid it, but this is about as close as I've ever gotten. So I found this listing on Craigslist, my favorite pastime to look for strange and interesting and untoward exotic cars. And this car was an 04 Arnage T here in Atlanta. And I recognized it because we'd actually had it for sale on consignment a couple years prior at Motor Cars of Georgia while I'd worked there. We hadn't sold it then because the guy wanted it on consignment like $90,000, and the car wasn't worth that then. And at this point that I was looking for it, a couple years ago, it was probably worth 55 to 60 grand, but the asking price in the ad was $35,000. And so I was kind of intrigued because it was cheap, but not so cheap that it seemed too good to be true. And Bentleys, as they age, are hard to sell. So I was kind of excited at this prospect that I might, have a good shot at this car. So I contacted the owner and asked him what the story was. And he gave me a little bit of information, but he really knew very little about the car. He hadn't really serviced it and had no idea what had happened to it before. But he said at the moment everything was sort of functional. But he went on to tell me that there was a little bit of a strange financial situation with the car. No surprise there, it's Craigslist and it's cars that I'm looking at, so this stuff happens. But he told me that he had recently got a title pawn loan on the car. So he had given the title to a local pawn shop and they had given him a loan on it. A reasonably common practice on $2,000 cars, but not really on Bentleys. But what he told me was that he wanted someone to go and buy the car from the pawn shop and give him another 90 days to buy it back. So he said, I'll let you buy it for a good deal because I can't buy it back right now, but I'd like the chance to buy it back from you at whatever you end up having into it. So I'm like, well, that's pretty cool. And he said he would give me, any registration fees and further cost or maintenance that I had to spend. So I'm like, the worst case scenario here is that I own this Bentley for free for about 3 months. And the best case scenario is I get a good deal on this car, drive it a couple of years and sell it like I normally would. So I said, sure, let me go take a look at it. So he had arranged with this pawn shop for someone to come and look at the car for him. And it got kind of strange, but I showed up and they said, yeah, well, Mr. Bolian, we're happy to show you the car. And the woman who was working there actually took me to a nearby public storage building. They hadn't stored the car in their local sort of lot. They'd put it somewhere, I guess, a little bit more safe because it probably cost as much as all the other cars they had there. So we went over there and obviously the battery was dead, but I'd brought a jump box. And so we got the car started and I sort of drove it around the block of storage buildings. And it was okay, it needed a little bit, there were a couple lights on, but kind of what you'd expect from an older Bentley that had been sitting for a little while. So I thanked her and left the car there and said, let me go make some calls and I'll call you back with an offer. But first I talked to the owner and I said, it's really not in the perfect shape you told me it is. It needs some things, but I really think the car's worth about 20 grand and I don't think they're going to take that. But maybe 22, 23. And he said, well, that's actually what they gave me for it. So it's always nice to have it reinforced that you're lowballing properly, because if I want to pay what a pawn shop's going to pay, then I'm usually pretty safe in a car. But I went on to say, all right, well, let me think about how much more it's worth to me. And I really like these types of deals because part of being a shrewd negotiator is not in necessarily the exchange, but it's in the circumstance. It's in setting yourself up to have the fewest competitors as possible when it comes to buying a car. So when you have circumstances like an old Bentley, in a pawn shop with a strange lien and a weird buyback clause and all these other things that really don't have anything to do with the car. They devalue it immediately, but over time that story doesn't matter anymore. So once I owned this thing, I would just be selling any old Bentley, not one out of a pawn shop that I might have to give back to this guy months later. So that type of circumstance tends to be a great way to buy a car if you come across the right opportunity at the right time. So what I told him was, all right, let me think about it. And I ended up saying, you know what, I think it's worth 25 grand. Let me call him. And he had said that with all the fees and with all the interest, he technically owed them 28. But I knew they might not think they'd get all that. So I said, all right, let me see if they'll do 25. So I called the owner of the pawn shop and I said, hey, I'll give you 25 grand for the car. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I said, all right, well, that's okay. So I kind of left it there. But a couple days went by and I said, you know what? I'm not going to lose the car over 3 grand. I called him back and said, you know what? 28's fine. I'll come in and I'll bring you a check, whatever you want, and I'll buy the car. And he said, you know what, Ed, I appreciate that, but we're just not going to worry about it. This has gotten too muddy. You know, he was technically past the point where he was supposed to be able to buy it back. So we're just going to send it down to a Florida dealer and they're going to deal with it. I said, okay, whatever. You know, here's another Bentley that I somehow avoided owning. Fantastic. So a couple of years go by. I truly think nothing else of it, but I get a call from some ambulance chasing personal injury attorney. And he says, are you Ed Boley? I said, yes, I am. He said, did you try to buy a Bentley off Craigslist a couple of years ago? I said, that could have happened. He kind of gave me some more details and I said, yep, that absolutely did. I remember trying to buy that car and they wouldn't let me at the pawn shop, so I really never worried about it again. He said, well, my client has filed a lawsuit against that pawn shop saying that they should have sold you the car because they had told him they would and that he was damaged through this process. And I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. I said, what do you mean he was damaged? I mean, he couldn't buy it. He said, well, he's saying that since you were willing to buy it and willing to let him buy it back, he missed out on the true value of the car. I said, all right, sure, whatever you need me to do. He said, well, we'll probably need a deposition at some point, and if it goes to trial, we might need you as a witness. I said, well, that sounds like fun. Count me in. Months go by, I hear nothing, but then I get a call from a lawyer representing the title pawn company. Okay? He says, well, we're still kind of wrapped up in this lawsuit, and I just want to kind of get an affidavit of exactly what happened in your own words. And I kind of walked him through what it was. He said, all right, well, I'm going to make some notes and I'll send something out to you. So he sent me some paperwork and said, you know, if this is what you recall happening, sign it. It was, so I did. But in the process of talking to the pawn shop's attorney, I was like, you know, look, this seems like a really weird lawsuit. I mean, what did y'all end up getting for the car? And he said, we sold it for about 31 grand after some reconditioning and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, I'm sure you've offered him the $3,000 between the 28 and the 31. And they're like, oh yeah, we've offered him more than that, but he's going after these crazy punitive damages. I said, that's weird. I don't really understand that. So when I talked to the previous owner's attorney, I was like, you know, forgive me for prying, but are you doing this on a contingency basis or is he paying you for this legal work? And he said, no, it's a contingency basis, which was obviously kind of common in that legal world. And I said, well, can you just explain to me how you're justifying the damages? And I said, well, in order for him to be damaged, he had to come into the ability to buy the car from me within 90 days of when we were trying to buy it. So how are you proving that with like bank statements or paychecks or liquidity or something like that? And he said, well, I don't think I could prove that. I said, well, then you don't have a case. If you can't prove that he was able to buy it back, you can't prove he was damaged. And he goes, did you tell their lawyer that? I said, no, I didn't tell their lawyer that. But they're lawyers. They understand this kind of thing, and they know what damages mean. They want to settle it clearly because they don't want to keep spending time and money on this process. You know, he's like, all right, well, I'll start working on that. So a few months go by and I get a subpoena in the mail, and they've gotten a date on a trial calendar for some local court, and they were coming up and they needed me to testify because essentially their whole case rested on my willingness to buy this thing and then sell it back to the guy a few months later. And they tell me that I've got like a 5-hour call, so they're gonna let me know when I need to show up. So days go by that week and I never get called, and it turns out they were a low priority that never got heard. So I talked to the lawyer on the customer side, and he just kind of said, well, we're kind of back to the drawing board. We'll keep going until we can get another trial date in a few months. And obviously I've never heard from him. I don't know what'll happen. Probably a whole lot of nothing, but you know, it just goes to show you that sometimes the most interesting stories are not about the cars you actually get to buy, it's the ones that you don't.
Are you looking to buy your dream car? Premier Financial Services offers the flexibility of financing with the tax benefits of leasing. The PFS Simple Lease offers quick approvals and easy termination when you are ready for the next car. Visit our website and follow us for more.